Hi, and welcome to this little primer about FAIR data and doctoral education. This is from the perspective of the FAIRsFAIR project, which means really fostering fair data practices in Europe. It's a 22-partner project that is funded, supported through the work program of the European Open Science Cloud and Horizon 2020. We address a lot of topics relating to fair data management, ranging from policies for fair data over certifying certain repositories, but also, and this is the focus here today, on the topic of skills, training, and competences for research data management. And the activities that I lead in the project is a work package on fair data science skills, really has identified doctoral education as one of the priorities of this work package. So I'm really happy to talk about this in more detail here. In this very brief presentation, I will touch upon a couple of different topics. First, I will just briefly present the FAIR principles. I will look into the question how they relate to open data and research data management. I will briefly also say something about the research data lifecycle and the different motivations really to make research data fair and to do research data management. Then I will look into some of the bottlenecks that we have identified for researchers to actually make this data fair. I will also provide some of my personal thoughts, how doctoral training relates to this whole question and what it can do about this. And finally, also a few thoughts about the project FAIRsFAIR and what we're doing to support fair skills and competences. Let's start with the FAIR principles first. So these 4 principles for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data really describe a certain quality of data sets that come out of the process of scientific research. If you look into detail, you'll see that there are 4 high-level principles, and these are broken down into certain other sub-level principles. Now, the term principles was really deliberately chosen because they really need to be translated into some sort of community standard and community practice in some cases, especially where it comes to the interoperability and the reusability of data, because that's not really something that, for example, a repository can really evaluate. And what you'll also see implicitly in there and explicitly, if you read a lot about the documents that are existing explaining the principles, is that this is really about the role of metadata that explains the data on the one hand, but also then on the role of repositories in actually making it findable and accessible, for example, through unique and persistent identifiers. And the other important thing is as well that fair data is supposed to be read not just by humans, but also by machines. That means that actually data set that is, let's say, perfectly fair should be able to be automatically linked or to be merged by automated decisions and processes by computers, where a human does not actually need to look into the data themselves anymore. What is also important to mention is that fair data does not automatically mean open data. So accessibility can mean that you can have a staged or restricted access mechanism towards certain data sets. And the other thing is, of course, that all these principles, that they need to be really thought through when you start a research project, because you cannot just make things fair in the end. For example, when you want to open or access to the data, you need to be sure that you have, for example, consent, or that you really follow all the legal regulatory requirements that are needed to publish data, for instance. This chart here really describes very well the relationship between fair data, open data, and also research data management. So you can have, for example, highly fair data where metadata is really nicely described, where you use certain standards that are interoperable with other research data sets. You can have open and closed data. So that means that you can, for example, have data in the public domain or something that is more closed or has restricted access to it. And you can also have managed and unmanaged data. So, for example, the data that is left on the stick somewhere compared to the data that is archived or put into a repository after at the end of a research project. And of course, managing data can also mean that you actually have data that is, for example, not fair because you don't fulfill the principles. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad data, but the idea is that we move towards more fair data because we have good arguments to do that, and I will come back to that later here in this presentation. The gist of much of this is really that you should think about research data management as a practice that is done throughout the entire research process. And here this idea of the research data lifecycle is a really good concept to use in this context, because it really says that actually from data creation over to the management of the research data to the repository where it will be stored or the catalogs where it will be registered, you can actually think about all of this from the start of a research project, or probably even before the start. And this relates also to the data management plans that you, for instance, can fill in before you start a project or just at the start of a project, because this really helps you to structure all this even before you start collecting the data. A really good question here is, of course, why to make your data fair? Why should you do research data management? What are the motivations behind it? Why are funders asking for more fair data and research data management plans, for instance, throughout projects? And there are a couple of different motivations that I think are really the ones that researchers should be aware of, but also institutions when they, for example, design their policies. And I think the first one is really the quality assurance of research. That means, for instance, reproduction of studies can be done better, which is a very important means of really verifying certain results. You can also do better peer reviews of studies, for instance, of papers where you submit your data together with your paper, and this means that it really enables and facilitates the quality assurance of research in the end. It's really one of the main ideas behind open science is to limit this issue that we have with the reproducibility crisis, and research data management is really a core thing to do that. Another one is also for researchers is important is that we know that papers, for example, have usually a little bit of a higher citation ratio when they come together with data sets that are published alongside. So there's some evidence hinting at this, that also for individual researchers, this is a good reason why to make your data fair together with, for example, the papers that you publish. Another one is, of course, that fair data and the description of how the data was collected, how and what standards are being used, really enables the wider reuse of data. And that also, in the end, gives you some advantages in efficiency of funding, for instance. So reuse could be, in this case, that you for instance, link this data or merge it with data sets from other researchers, so that you just have a bigger data set that you can use in academic settings. But it could also mean that this data could be used, for example, if it's available for this purpose by companies to, for example, develop products or to verify studies on their own, which they might want to build products upon. So, for example, in the biomedical field, you might have a paper and you want to be sure before you start, like really putting some R&D behind that, and then it's a good way to start with actually looking into that paper and trying to reproduce that. Another big one that we really try to move towards is the recognition and rewards of open science outputs. So, of course, we do in the near future, hopefully, want to have rewards and recognition for more scientific outputs of researchers. That means not just papers or peer-reviewed papers, but also look into software, data, code, or certain other types of impact, for example, that your research has beyond citations, for example. And for that, you really need to just start saying, okay, actually data management is a really important part of the research process that should be rewarded. You should maybe be rewarded when you prepare your data in a highly professional way, and if you release it and if you share that according to certain requirements, for instance. And for that, you just need to start actually collecting information about that. And this is, for example, where data management plans are important, but also unique identifiers for researchers such as ORCIDs really help to make this visible that researchers are contributing to this kind of work as well. And the final one is accountability, and with that I mainly mean that on the one hand, RDM helps you to think about, for example, legal and regulatory issues that that you need to follow during a research project. So, for example, data protection rules or certain other ethical rules. Of course, this is already done, but it does help to put this under the umbrella of research data management to be sure that this is really something that is inherent in research practices. And another form of accountability is, of course, as well that much of research is funded with public funding. So there's also a certain sense of accountability towards actually making the research outputs available to others, because in the end you're using public money and this should maybe be as accessible as possible in the end. And there are big studies, for example, from the European Commission or for the European Commission that say that there could be an efficiency gain of around 10 billion euros if more research data was fair. So there are certain really macroeconomic benefits of making data better available and better accessible and more reusable across Europe. Of course, fair data is also a relatively new concept. Research data management is really an emerging practice. So there are, of course, bottlenecks. Not everybody is doing it yet like by the book, but it's really something that is being developed and is being taken up by institutions, by funders, but also by researchers. And one thing, first of all, is that you need to be aware what you should do, or about the FAIR principles, for instance. We see, for example, in this study from the state of open data, that at least the awareness of researchers is increasing over time about actually they do have some awareness of the FAIR principles. They have some higher level of familiarity, and this is really a long-term process, but it's increasing. So this is a good development, but this awareness in the end also needs to be translated into practice. And there we see also from the same study that there is some actually awareness that researchers do need different skills to to do RDM, to follow certain rules and regulations. And this is, for example, in the field of long-term storage or data management strategies, or understanding and policies for access, which is, I think, really a big question about how to make access safe and legal and secure for different levels of users, for instance. But overall, this also shows that quite a lot of the respondents are actually quite confident about defining data management plans, for instance, or describing their metadata. So in this case, it's about one third says already they are comfortable doing that. So that's a good sign, but there definitely is some more space for improvement. This is in the end leading towards some sort of paradigm shift, or just say a big change in the culture of how to do research. So this is really important. Now, talking about this question of awareness and skills, I think doctoral education is really where this is important, because in the end, researchers do learn about the research practice in their specific field, and in general during doctoral training to the most highest extent. Of course, some probably also learn about it during their masters to a certain degree, but the practical implementation really comes at the doctoral stage. So, and because this is really where researchers learn how research in their field works, which tools and methods you use, and which outputs even are deemed important by their peers, this is really a crucial field where some more awareness, in my opinion, and some more application of FAIR data and data management is really going to have a high impact. This is also because I think where you learn your work and research in your discipline, you will in the end you will in the end learn how research in your discipline works, and this is really why it's important, because doctoral education is really training the future researchers in a certain field, in a discipline, but also in interdisciplinary research, and that is actually a big idea of FAIR data as well. So I think this is really why doctoral education has a structuring effect on the future generations of researchers and also professionals to do more RDM and to really be the people who start this shift that actually is also very much linked with other topics that doctoral education touches upon. So, for example, research ethics and integrity. Usually, doctoral students will learn something about this, or will be facing certain issues, for example, with ethics and integrity. They need to do some training, and this is really where RDM can also be a practice. It actually supports the practical implementation of certain ethics and integrity question in terms of like quality assurance of your own work and following certain legal requirements, for instance. And that's why I think doctoral education is really important for the long-term change as well. So we will not have everything perfectly fair in the next, say, 1 to 5 years, but maybe in the next 5 to 10, we can really make a big leap towards more fair data, however that is measured, at a larger scale. And this is really why I think that doctoral education is really important in there, because it really has the potential to really transform research practices from the level of the upcoming generation. This is also hopefully then to trickle down a little bit into the previous levels of qualification. So, for example, at the master or bachelor level. And we also, what we see in the FAIRsFAIR work is that actually universities are really interested in this topic. They say to a very high extent that they really want to strengthen research data management training at the doctoral level. This is actually the highest level that we surveyed, that we found in this survey, that 90% almost of the universities that we asked said, yes, we do see a high need. So there is also not just a perception of me, but apparently at the sector at a more wider scale, that this is really something where work needs to be done. And now, after all this, just a few words on what FAIRsFAIR, the project, is actually doing, because we are really working in the space of research data and fair data specifically through our different activities. So what we've done specifically in the work that EUA has been leading is we have mapped, as was shown just one slide before, the needs of universities in the field of data management trainings through a survey, through focus groups. We've also mapped more abstract documents such as frameworks that define skills and competences at different levels and how they relate to fair data, for instance, in order to design education programs in the future with a little bit more focus on research data management. We have ongoing activities, for example, in more better definition of fair competences and skills and how they, for example, relate to bachelor, master, and doctoral level. We are working together with some other partners who are leading this activity on a more standard vocabulary for data stewardship skills and competences, so that we can really talk to each other across different initiatives about what do we actually mean with data management skills and competences, and also with the idea to really support the professionalization of this area, but also to support education programs in adopting these skills and to understanding how they can maybe integrate these skills into certain learning units, for instance. We work regularly together with other initiatives in this field through workshops, for instance. We do also hands-on trainings for data stewards and early career researchers. And upcoming in this area is also the output of a FAIR training handbook, so a document that should help universities in actually integrating FAIR data and RDM more generally into their educational offers. This will be supported also by a couple of capacity building workshops where we do some train the trainers. This will be coming during 2021. And we will also top this up with a report on actually the good practices that we found in terms of RDM and FAIR training at universities at different levels. And you can find everything about the project and its different outputs, upcoming events under the links shown there. Don't hesitate to also send me a message if you're interested to know more or you want to get in touch to maybe work together. I think these are really great opportunities. We have really specifically looked at doctoral education and do want to be much more active in this area. It's a priority for us, and I would be happy to talk to you soon.